very much for being here. Thank you very much to Militz and Pasi that are not here, but part of the organization. Thank you, as always, to Kiane, who is behind the cameras, and Martin, who's also helping us with setting up everything. So yes, we are starting this session on Territory, which is a series of public debates on the political economy of architecture and territory.
So for those of you who haven't been here before, the topic of this year's sessions really began when we started to notice patterns of language that come up around the topic of climate change that really insist on this vocabulary of urgency. So you see words like crisis, words like emergency come up over and over again, and you start to see how they've been taken by corporations and different governments as a way to, in part, shift the burden of environmental harm away from thinking about systems of extraction and pollution to all of us individuals who are now responsible for recycling more, consuming less, and managing the consequences of our own behaviors. And so this kind of discourse has come to induce physiological side effects, amongst which climate anxiety has become one of the most prevalent. And this term, climate anxiety, describes conditions like muscle tension, quickened breathing, and high heart rates that have been attributed to fear of impending environmental disaster. So since we're caught between this discourse of crisis and also the very looming threat of environmental catastrophe itself, we've all been forced to reflect on our own positions in the middle of this material and political consequences of climate change. So this lecture series takes the built environment as our primary field of inquiry, though we've certainly branched outside of that already, as a way to better understand how we begin to perceive our own subjective position. So the way that we contribute, our vulnerabilities, complicities, and anxieties, all in the face of this impending catastrophe. So by shifting analysis between planetary scales and that of the body, we ask, in what ways have built form and regulated land structured the way that people locate themselves against the effects of climate change?
So throughout the semester, we're looking to scholars and creatives who have addressed similar concerns through their own work. We have already heard from an atmospheric chemist, two curators from MoMA, and Alexander Gische, current theater director of Schauspielhaus in Zurich. And today we begin the second half of the series, which turn to more historical approaches. And we will begin with the work of Orit Halpern. On the 13th, which is next Monday, we will have Deborah Cohen, who's a historian of science. And on the 22nd, which is going to be Wednesday, we will have Eva Horn, who's a literature scholar. So today, Orit Halpern is a full professor and chair of digital cultures at the Technische Universität of Dresden. Her work bridged the history of science, computing, and cybernetics with design. She's currently working on two projects. The first is a history of intelligence and evolution. The second examines the extremes infrastructure and the history of experimentation at planetary scales in design, science, and engineering. She has also published widely in many venues, including Critical Inquiry, Grey Room, Journal of Visual Culture, and Influx. Her first book, Beautiful Data, A History of Vision and Reason, investigates the history of big data, design, and governmentality. And her current work with Robert Mitchell is titled The Smartness Mandate. So Orit also leads the project Against Catastrophe, a project intended to interrogate the concept of catastrophe, how it is defined, analyzed, and deployed, and anti-catastrophic practices in an attempt to envision alternatives to our present. So Orit, thank you very much for being with us today. We're gonna have a lecture by Orit, and then we're going to follow by a response by Tomás, who will be introduced later and before opening the floor for everyone. So,
well, thank you. Do you guys hear me well enough? I'll hold it here. Maybe you can hear me from here.
The microphone better, or?
Doesn't matter. All right, everyone hears me. Great. Well, first, thank you both, Tomás, for inviting me and being here, and thank you all for being here to listen to me, or maybe you're forced to. But anyway, today I'm going to talk about what I'm calling resilient futures. I don't know if climate anxiety is the emotion, maybe more like pessimistic optimism, like, you know, things aren't going so well, but a little more technology, maybe it'll be okay. And my work on resilience actually came out of doing work on smart cities and places. So what we're looking at here is Kolkata. It's an area called Rajat 5 that's been designated by Modi as a smart city. Of course, these smart cities are actually, despite being supposedly green and enhancing both economic and environmental well-being, of course, dispossess vast numbers of people and are actually being built on top of the Kolkata wetlands, which are actually, the East Kolkata wetlands are actually the only water management system for this city. And you can see them kind of the forefront. They're also major sites of fishing, like localized fishing and protein resource for many of the poor citizens of Kolkata, and serve a vital both economic, therefore, and ecological function. This sort of examination of this sort of development and the kind of ways smartness is transforming territory, but also its kind of many impacts have sort of led me to be thinking quite critically about how we historicize the idea of smartness and ubiquitous computing, and also the broader epistemologies, practices, and political economies that follow with them. And of course, this my work started in places like Songdo. It was also a sort of supposed response to the 1998 Asian currency crisis. There's so many of them, which is part of the theme of this talk, really, that was supposed to guarantee the future of South Korea, both economically and ecologically, through computational capacities for self-organization, learning, adaptation, and innovation. A lot of this work comes out of my recently, from last year, published book with Robert Mitchell, The Smartness Mandate, but it's also part of new projects where I'm hoping to think about ecology and economy, hopefully with you. Today, outside of those momentary architectural and infrastructural discussions, a lot of this talk is actually going to be kind of history of science and history of economics, but I hope you'll bear with me. So today we appear to be in an era beset supposedly by catastrophic events, pandemics, anti-democratic resurrections, wars, climate change. If there's a unique feature, however, to this barrage of seemingly catastrophic events, it's their seeming banality and ubiquity. These ongoing events appear to evade historical demarcation as events either revolutionary or catastrophic, replacing such historical demarcation through terms such as the new normal and even next normal that kind of circulated ubiquitously after COVID and circulate ad nauseum throughout news outlets and social networks. And in turn, policy makers, psychologists, ecologists, and business strategists all urge making systems, institutions, and even human subjects resilient, capable of enduring and even profiting from change and crisis. And of course, we've had a lot of analyses of disaster capitalism. So I'm not like the only person, but I specifically want to identify what's unique about resilience as a logic inside this idea. So, for example, in the latest Davos conference that was held a year ago, not this latest one, but the one right before, the World Economic Forum announced that resilience would become one of the central concepts organizing global response to the war in the Ukraine, the climate crisis, and the after effects of the COVID pandemic. The forum identified a series of central challenges or frontier risks, and I got to be on this frontier risk working group. I don't know how much I contributed, but but it was interesting ethnographically. Anyway, so they identified things like rapid technological change, climate disturbances, economic volatility and disparity, balkanization, and kind of and ethno-nationalism all rose to the top of their kind of risks. These risks, if not managed correctly, even capitalized upon, would pose dangers to globalization and plural democracy. Institutions, therefore, need to become resilient. And as people like here's the president of international markets at Dell Technology, Angus Hegarty, put it, we need digital resilience. That's right. This digital resilience is a position, it allows enterprises to pivot fast, adapt to fluid conditions, maintain seamless business continuity, and capitalize on opportunities. So there's of course, we assume that this also kind of feeds into Dell's business model. But anyway, digital resilience builds the economies of tomorrow on the foundation of cybersecurity. So we have this new kind of fantasy emerging around a kind of rapidly adaptive, computationally embedded, because kind of the idea to be able to be big data, or even to introduce artificial intelligence so that systems can learn from themselves immediately and adapt continuously onto these ideas. Of course, as any sort of discussion of these sort of things comes up, we immediately come to understand, the minute we hear words like normal, we think about the 19th century and the race and the kind of racial and scientific discourses that surrounded ideas of normalcy and, population. So, the early kind of construction of race and statistics that kind of produced ideas of normal. So also, what is at stake, therefore, in any discussion of resilience is fundamentally, therefore, how we understand social, natural, and technical change. So we're not only discussing in these concepts technology, right, but we're also talking basically our models of evolution, adaptation, and learning that we put into the technology. So what is it? It's the very idea, as I mentioned, of the normal curve was an invention in the 19th century human sciences underpinning contemporary understandings of nature, economies, population, and race. The order of nature, if we will, could be replicated by the order of society. But the normal is also embedded in ideas, here's Darwin's models of evolution. How do systems change? And when did events happen? Were extinction events norms or part of regular occurring processes? If the concept of revolution was central organizing concept for change, whether in a capitalism modeled on reductive ideas of evolutionary fitness, or in Marxism through dialectical contest, then the concept of both constantly evolving but never revolutionary systems appears novel. If nature is no longer, so we've kind of countered, right, this idea of a kind of evolution of progress, and of course I'm not the only person saying this, but the question is, what are these new models of evolution? So if nature is no longer untouched by technology, then we might ask, what new concepts of history, governance, and technology are emerging? And so my intent is to briefly historically situate this new nature and new normal in its relationship to managing risk and futurity. And I'm just kind of showing kind of these new models that start emerging. The 1970s are the main pivot, things like Gaia, that start to see Earth system, geological systems, and human systems, right, immersed in something that we now maybe call the Anthropocene. So resilience seems to be the discourse, if we will, of this kind of transformation. But the idea of the world is always volatile and uncertain was not always considered the norm of nature. I'm not going to go back to the 19th century, but for the moment, I'm going to go back to the 1950s or 1940s and the emergence of cybernetically informed ideas of ecology. So ideas of communication and information. And here you're seeing an image from the famous Macy conferences in cybernetics, H.E. Hutchinson, who was an ecologist, kind of imagining, nature, if you will, or an ecological system in terms of kind of these flow charts and feedback loops and communication systems. So these ideas that were kind of grounded in kind of cybernetic ideas of everything being made out of a communicative agent talking to each other kind of emerged out of American empire itself and things like nuclear bomb testing, in this case in the Marshall Islands. So we have to really think also, of course, as kind of these sites, these colonized sites of experiments that kind of produce these imaginaries of communication systems and linked up. But one of the things that things like nuclear bomb tests allowed ecologists, it was a new way to visualize life and a new way to manage it. So the Odoms, who are perhaps the most famous American ecologists, who kind of really introduced very heavily this idea of kind of nature's interconnectedness and sort of ecology, kind of worked in these spaces. And you can see, for example, these little fishes, you can see the radiation, you could trace the radiation actually going through the ecosystem. So you could actually visualize, right, the metabolic processes of the system and it's and where, you know, what was eating what and so on and so forth. So this allowed people to see and understand ecosystems in new ways, as well as producing kind of these new computationally rendered ideas. So these models were grounded in communication sciences and tested on the landscape of nuclear blast site, and they tended to valorize stability. So the model, the ecosystem model, the kind of Cold War vision, right, of keeping the, you know, no one having an atomic, you know, a nuclear war. So ecosystems were supposed to be made of feedback loops that aspired to balance, much like the early models of the homeostat coming out of the sciences of communication and control. And imbalance was to be avoided, just like in the Cold War, and systems should be managed for stability. So the idea was that ecosystems had a balance that human beings might throw off, but that then they had to be returned back to this baseline kind of normative system. So the most extensive effort at kind of using this logic to compute the future of the planet and its population was now infamous limits to growth. You're seeing the world model here envisioned. It's, of course, a substantial act of hubris to think you can model the world, but anyway, it kind of, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this report, so I'm not going to go into it, but it came out in 1972, and it modeled essentially this closed world with limited resources that had to be kept in balance. And it was, of course, the clarion call to an emergent environmental movement. So this computerized report saw a world in need of balance, one where change was an anomaly, not a norm. The computer science modeled human behavior and populations as aberrations, producing terminal traumas on the environment that would lead to catastrophe. And the answer to it is to restore the balance of the planet through the careful management of feedback loops and return it to a sustainable state. However, while this report gained lots of notoriety and was really popular, a lot of people actually didn't agree. And at the exact same time, a new set of ideas were coming up. This is charts from a little bit after 1970s, but some of the people I'm talking to worked a lot on fishery and forestry management. And this is kind of a classic case of what ecologists started to find endemic to quote unquote nature. Many ecologists, environmentalists, and economists did not agree with the limits to growth. Ecosystems, they argued, did not appear to stabilize after suffering disruption. There'd be no going back to some historically less damaged planet. So things like DDT and Rachel Carson's discussion demonstrated the destructive results impacting systems far outside the immediate locus of intended insect elimination, and also demonstrated that things lasted in the environment. You couldn't get rid of toxicity just like that, right? Just stopping to use DDT didn't remove the DDT from the ecosystem. Agent Orange, heavily used in Vietnam War as a defoliant, and related dioxins were demonstrated to produce long-ranging impacts in humans and ecosystems. And the list went on at the time of evidence that, like, you couldn't just go back to a previous state. Just ceasing the use of a toxin or an attempt to reseed an environment did not return systems to their past. Even seemingly environmentally friendly actions, such as lowering fishing quotas, for example, here on Georgia's Bank, irrespective, there's this crash in cod populations. and cod stocks, like in the 70s and early 80s, and they close the banks, they do everything, but the fishes just don't come back. Something else is going on. So, and even if you replant trees, again, it didn't seem that the forests were coming back in vibrant ways. So nature appeared to be constantly changing or evolving. And it wasn't just ecologists who were developing this idea. Friedrich Hayek, in his Nobel Peace Prize in 1974, loudly proclaims his first target is the limit to growth report, saying, oh, devastating. The problem is the hubris of these scientists thinking they know the future and thinking we can plan on it. This is horrible. And in a certain sense, he's talking about a notion that kind of launched, if we will, neoliberal economic thinking, which is fundamentally the unknowability and unpredictability of complex systems. That fundamentally systems are self-organizing, emerging. They come through spontaneous, if you read at the bottom, spontaneous processes outside of conscious human control. So complexity makes it impossible for us to actually plan, which is kind of his attack on kind of state-sponsored or centralized planning. He goes on to say, you know, man must guard against becoming an accomplice in the fatal striving to control society. And this is the original paper. This is straight from the same speech. Instead, civilization has come from the free efforts of millions of individuals. And throughout his work in neoliberal economics, continued to insist on this vision of the market being a kind of evolutionary or naturalized kind of thing that itself would guarantee evolution without direction or planning. So only markets could coordinate the subjective decisions of each of us that's kind of very limited. We don't have full information. We're kind of little swarms or something. And the market is the only thing that can decide at scale. And it does so in the same manner as quote unquote nature, a nature that is now seen as constantly evolving, regularly volatile, and kind of this sort of networked emerging system that cannot be fully predicted due to its volatility and complexity. And similar, and this kind of emerges with the specific idea of resilience in ecology. So what was the concept of ecology that emerged also at this very same moment in the 1970s? In a very, very famous paper that I'm showing you a series, these are future kind of possible futures that emerge out of particular population conditions. So this is essentially, you're looking at C.S. Halling culling data from other people's studies, kind of projecting different possible behaviors of an ecosystem into the future. So there's never just one, and there's always multiple different. There's not just like one equilibrium point for an ecosystem. In this famous paper, C.S. Halling, who was a Canadian ecologist working for the Forestry Service, so largely looking at maintaining economy actually in forests and kind of maintaining these things, came up with a new model. In the opening statement of this article, he says, individual die, population disappears, and species become extinct. That is one view of the world. But another view of the world concentrates not so much on presence or absence as upon the numbers of organisms and the degree of constancy of their numbers. These are two very different ways of viewing the world. So what does Halling mean here? Halling posits a world where even change, catastrophic, is a norm, heralds not the end of systems, but their evolution. So we're no longer going to count the numbers of animals and who's alive and dead or what went extinct. We're going to look instead at the relationship between different organisms in the ecosystem. These degrees, these relations of constancy in their numbers. Extinctions happen, but systems, degrees, and evolution continue. Rather than focusing on the event of extinction, ecologists should instead think about the relationships in a system. The environment itself had to become a system, one that had properties that, like programs, perhaps might be maintained irrespective of the life or death of individuals. So what happens here is we focus on maintaining the relations, not the single lives or deaths of individual animals or people eventually. So ecology, and of course, and this vision of the world, so ecology and economy have of course long been linked. So it's not just Halling that suddenly puts up this idea also of constant change along with the attacks of neoliberal economists on limits to growth. But of course, literally in the same year, we also see Milton Friedman introduce the idea of a need for a broad-based, widely active and resilient futures market in currencies. This was done again in the face of the end of Bretton Woods and the stability of the kind of gold standard exchange. In many ways, Milton Friedman is suggesting, but there are also ways that it differs. And I'm going to talk a bit about how neoliberal economics and ecology might not also converge perfectly and what we might be able to do with that separation. He also basically is like, well, now we have to think about currencies not as kind of single set entities, but as relational entities, and that we can actually excavate or activate the volatility of their relations in order to make bets into the future. So anyway, this returns us to, and I just want to kind of keep that in the background as we think about this, and we'll come back to the relationship between ecology and ecology. So what exactly is Halling talking about in terms of his idea of resilience? His argument is that essentially the regular kind of forms of counting that ecology had been obsessed with, or the extinction or preservation of one species or another, ignored the beginning and created an overemphasis on predator-prey relationships and ignored more complex interactions and overvalued equilibrium. So the idea is always maintaining equilibrium kind of was a problem from an ecological management standpoint. From his perspective, nitrogen, carbon, and other cycles, interactions of mutual aid, collaboration, or competition between many species not structured just into standard predator-prey were kind of shut out of the previous types of models. And a myriad of other factors might permit ecosystems to persevere in their functions, even if in mutated or varied form. So extinction might not be the limit to growth or change in a system unless it fundamentally transformed a complex web of interactions. So in many ways, he's thinking very seriously about a sort of transforming what we might think a limit to life. Extinction could now be kind of made plastic, if you will, through replacing it with a new series of ideas, primarily around maintaining ecosystem services. That's the term we currently use. So to give you an example, these are topological models generated from historical data that he was talking about since 1951 of budworm, spruce, and fir tree populations in a Canadian forest. And interestingly enough, these are also some of the first geographic information system use with satellites. So this was kind of critical to developing contemporary GIS and GPS systems. So it's also key to understand resilience, just like the earlier ideas of homeostasis and cybernetics, as kind of closely linked to media and other technologies, right? Without the new sensor and satellite systems, these new topographies of data couldn't be visualized in these forests. So Halling basically was arguing, let's go back to our little chart, and you can see different densities of population. The question here in the case of the boreal forest is not the absolute number of spruce pine trees, but what's important is the ability of the forest to rejuvenate and continue growing trees at all. So there's like a service that the boreal forest provides, which is trees, I guess, and this is going to include fluctuating numbers of population and constant variations between spruce, fir, birch, and budworms. So the system is regularly changing, as you can see. And in general, this allows the forest as a forest to continue existing, even though at certain moments you may almost see the disappearance of one type of tree or maybe the budworm. So these things are kind of constantly going up and down. So better ecological management might also apprehend the fact that systems ultimately change. For example, forests in Ontario increasingly were being used for leisure and vacationing rather than for forestry, and their management had to change accordingly. For other systems, one might imagine a different process or processes defining them. Today, as I mentioned, we deploy the term ecosystem services, a direct result of Holling's work, and other kind of the Stockholm Resilience Center. There's a bunch of really big institutions that have taken this up and then introduced it through particularly logistics and management discourses. So sustainability was the language. So resilience for Holling denoted the capacity, as I said, of the system itself to change during periods of intense internal perturbation. And the concept of resilience enabled a management approach to ecosystems that would, in his words, managers would have to emphasize the need to keep options open, the need to view events in a regional rather than local context, and the need to emphasize heterogeneity. So there's some really interesting key ideas here in the concept of management that's emerging out of this ecological thinking. The first is, of course, since you're interested in territory, that there's this kind of expansion or rethinking of the geographies of the ecosystem. So you're thinking in a regional rather than local context. You're always thinking relationally. Systems are also changing over time. So you have a temporal dimension. Secondly, of course, there's this new idea of kind of predictive or anticipatory management, but in management that's always about multiple options. So, right, just like you have multiple futures possible. And then finally, this question of heterogeneity that I'm going to come back to. So interestingly, and perhaps this is the driver between the ecological understanding and the economic, diversity is a key feature for the maintenance of ecosystem services in this discourse. Why? Because if you're perfectly adapted, right, to a particular niche, then if the environment changes or something happens, you don't have enough, you don't have resilience built in. The system can't adapt because there's only like, you know, one year, the companies that are cutting the trees are only building, you know, are only putting in fir trees because they grow really fast, and now suddenly it got hotter, there are more budworms or what have you. The system can't adapt or manage to those changes. And this, of course, immediately became an incredibly central idea in management fields way outside of ecology. This is just kind of a kind of standard vision of the adaptive management process. And today we talk about adaptive management all the time, which tries to kind of constantly see these feedback loops and transformation. You kind of have all your stakeholders and assessment problems and reflexive knowledge production. Interestingly enough, of course, in this sense, resilience is also defined in relationship to crisis and states of exception. That is, resilient management and adaptive management are only a virtue when such states are assumed to be permanent or quasi-constant, and that managers are constantly having to deal, you know, with supposedly black swan or extreme events. Holling also underscored that the movement from valuing stability to valuing resilience depended on an epistemological shift. And this is one of my key points and where I want us to think back to that Hayek. You're like, why is she bringing him in? The epistemology of ignorance is a central concept in resilience, or how to stop worrying and start managing. So I guess your climate anxiety is now a bureaucratic imperative. So flowing from this, according to Holling, would be not the presumption of sufficient knowledge, so all of us are as usual ignorant, but the recognition of our ignorance, not the assumption that future events are expected, but that they will be unexpected. And this is a really key feature for me also about thinking about smartness and artificial intelligence, is things that are always kicking in to support or assist or aid the rather fallible and ignorant human decision makers. So This, of course, resonates back with Frederick Hayek's, arguments made at the same time about how we have to stop trying to control things, and we have to remember that there's no consciousness, right? And that we have to develop these new managerial strategies, right, that are adaptive. I also note that in the midst of this kind of reconfiguration of both ecology and economy is happening within a particular context, right? It is not only ecosystems that have become volatile and uncertain, and perhaps this is why adaptive management doesn't stay in ecology. It becomes central to logistics, to all corporate management, to any number of other systems, urban planning. Obviously, there are many resilience managers just about everywhere. The rise of these ideas, of course, comes in the face of also geopolitical transformations. Decolonization, so the idea of both for the new currency markets and ecology came up in conditions where people were having problems predicting the future and managing or securing, or particularly corporations were having issues with access and management of materials. So these new ideas of nature came in that context where older models of political economy were in flux. So the end of Bretton Woods, decolonization, post-Fordism, the post-civil rights backlash in the United States, and that things like the 1973 oil embargo produced a new spate of technologies for adapting. And this is the Black-Scholes derivative pricing equation, which kind of emerged out of Milton Friedman and Hayek's kind of theory and work as a way for corporations to manage risk and hedge risk over kind of under these conditions of rapidly changing commodity markets in particular, and stagflation and the petrodollar crisis. So I'm not going to go into this, but a lot of my work actually looks and examines at these risk management strategies. But my only point here is to try to emphasize the fact that under that the kind of the political, the eco-economic, I guess, ideas are kind of emerging in this more complex situation where increasingly uncertainty and volatility are seen as things that have to be managed. So these are kind of technologies and techniques of dealing with things like decolonization, race warfare, and energy crises. So there are three summary points I want to underscore as we kind of wind up. The first is that resilience within this particular genealogy assumes, as I've mentioned quite often, uncertainty and volatility as common, perhaps quote unquote normal. And we can ask what's at stake in these kind of discourses of the norm. As a corollary, of course, of this, the life and death of individuals or even populations is secondary to the ongoing evolution of systems. So in that sense, resilience is a new way to model systems and therefore also measure them. See, we're looking at relations, right, instead of static numbers. And we're looking at things like services. So that you need this new model to be able to envision an ecosystem in that language, perhaps. I mean, maybe this would be an interesting question for the 19th century, how similar or distant these ideas of kind of, all these complex cycles and managing them and kind of looking and measuring these relations as a mode of kind of dealing with constant change and managing essentially change. So instead of taxonomy and organizing populations into stable categories, one must define system in terms of processes. And here you can actually see a chart, right, that does that and measures the relationship between populations and potentially other factors, nitrates, carbon, energy. A corollary to this approach is that past data can be used to build concepts, but can never actually predict the future. So there's a fine line people had to play between like using the past to predict the future and assuming that the future would never replicate the past. So on one hand, you're obviously collecting endless amounts of data, and now you have GIS and GPS and all these things. But on the other hand, you kind of have sort of a chink there on the predictive value of that. So probability becomes a kind of central question and how to deal with that. And therefore, you get this sort of new question of kind of generating multiple futures for managerial purposes. And finally, and most interesting, and perhaps interestingly to me, is that despite all the kind of economic and seemingly functional features of resilience, diversity is also a key feature to the model of resilience in this system, because so on one hand, resilience has this feature where on one hand, certain lives or population are acceptably sacrificed as long as the system continues to operate, right? Because we're interested in the operations, not the individual lives of populations. And on the other hand, and that this trauma is actually regularized, right, as a normalized event. On the other hand, environmental managers recognize that only systems with robust diversity, redundancy, and supplemental capacities might survive abrupt and catastrophic events. So resilience sort of fluctuates between two poles of Darwinian evolutionary theory, survival of the fittest, and the necessity for variety and diversity within and between populations to allow for adaptation. So if you're too perfectly optimized, you're actually going to collapse, you're going to die. And this is interesting, and so this is an interesting kind of quandary for people. So the result, of course, is the emergence of these ideas of ecosystem services, as I had already mentioned, and here you can see kind of a chart of, and you can see kind of organisms, interaction, living, non-living. So these are kind of new models that really allow us to take up these kind of reconceptualization of Earth systems in new ways. And of course, Earth system science develops as well. These are also perhaps new ways of understanding territory. So here, for example, is a mapping according to resilience of large urban areas that's looking at what we call ecosystem bundles, right? So you're seeing of Mumbai, Las Vegas, Berlin. So you're seeing the city related to the hinterland or to other ecosystems that are around it. So on one hand, you have these different possibilities, and on the other hand, of course, you have these highly functional modes of optimization and management. So now we're left with questions. So Mark, so as we've mentioned, this brings me to the present and to some of our more contemporary ideas of resilience and so in the wake in the early 2000s, following 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis and climate change, resilience has taken a central discursive place in fields ranging from business management and logistics to psychology and to psychology. So particularly after 9/11, for example, most major corporations, I guess, introduced resilience planning. That they had to actually demonstrate that they could deal with it. And obviously this is accelerated now with the climate crisis, where many, both people dealing with logistics and supply chains, but also just standard corporations have like contingency plans for massive events. And just to kind of showcase contingency planning, does anybody know which gleaming, this is Hurricane Sandy in New York City. Does anybody know what that one gleaming building is? Goldman Sachs. Anyway, so the whole thing can go down. There's all sorts of questions about how real or not, but I have downloaded Goldman Sachs resilience plans. They have them. So obviously somebody was doing their planning, and if we think of Lower Manhattan's main and central service being financed, then of course this makes perfect sense. So we've maintained this even as Red Hook's public housing projects drown. So in the aftermath of COVID-19, the wake of the war with Ukraine, and currently also the wars in the Middle East, you can find a massive number of articles, websites, and consulting service dedicated to logistics, psychology, and community activism, and of course also the situations with China. So everything from resilient leadership to supply chain security. And this has a particular tie-in right now with using AI and digital twinning that I'm very interested in order to, and in this case, in the case of this management consulting firm that's going to introduce artificial intelligence and generative AI into using your big data to ensure that your procurement and supply chains can constantly adapt and transform. You're going to future-proof your supply chain. So just-in-time manufacturing is now just in case, and corporations are urged to increase their options, diversify supply chains geographically, and begin thinking about plasticity in manufacturing infrastructure, and to identify vital services and processes ahead of time. And I'm sure you hear a lot about this: renationalization, rebalkanization, et cetera. For many neoliberal and right-leaning politicians, resilience has also been a call to expend populations they don't value. So just as an example of kind of the way making the economy resilient cost lives, in the case of the US during COVID, we see that there's kind of disparate death, the racial disparities in COVID death rates and stuff, because we had to keep vital systems operating. So resilience clearly has these deeply nefarious and violent elements where it kind of becomes a legitimacy for violence and the ongoing annihilation of environmental protection, civil rights, and social justice in the name of saving the economy. So resilience can become a mode of naturalizing violence. So here we must contend with how we understand evolution and genealogy. And in the last few minutes, I'll think about financial and logistical comprehensions of resilience largely assume a world of scenario plans and unanticipatable futures divorced from historical legacy or context, which becomes its own issue. But of course, resilience also produces new possibilities, ones that I'm sure that many of you in this room probably deal with quite regularly. So here's just a classic case of, managing water in the Everglades, where you have kind of the production in the 30s of during the New Deal of kind of these hard infrastructures. We try to drain the swamps and do all this stuff, versus, of course, contemporary ideas that begin to see the city in relationship. I'm not saying they're actually accomplishing this. This is Florida, after all. And we should then actually think about the other side of the finance. But nonetheless, people fantasize, right? Being able to manage these more fluid and open relations to the environment as a way of managing kind of nature-based management and resilience. This is a bunch of pictures I took when I was in Boston of also these efforts to develop wetlands as part of kind of thinking about resilience that includes thinking about the ecosystem and rethinking traditional maybe separations, probably, again, not anyone here having them, but between nature and culture and urban, rural and urban and the environment, or technology and the environment. And of course, this question of diversity as being a central feature to resilience. And I've been thinking about that not only in terms of how we're building our cities and how we're imagining our societies and what forms of relationality are possible if we rethink our models of evolution, adaptation, and even learning. But of course, also in relationship to things like artificial intelligence, where lacks of diversity are either over-optimizing the model or under-optimizing it and creating a lot of falsity, creates what we call model collapse, right? So that systems kind of learn endlessly, but can't actually kind of manage what they're doing. Or kind of collapse as a result of kind of hyper either optimization or too much generalization. So how we think about that, but also increasingly as we're giving our artificially intelligent systems sort of biological characteristics of being able to learn, adapt, and manage change, how does that do? And also what kind of ideas might open up around biodiversity, the archive, and temporality? So on one hand, we always have biodiversity reduced to a service, that we need biodiversity because it supports us. But of course, there's other thinking that comes from evolutionary biology. This is Richard Prum, who likes to think about evolution and excess and ecosystems as possible sites of potential imagination and coexistence. And also I've been thinking about, the questions of resilience and how we preserve things by looking forwards. How do we think about this as we go forward towards synthetic biology or other forms of symbiosis and speculation, as in Daisy Ginsburg's work around designing for the sixth extinction. So I'm just gonna leave us with these kind of wider thoughts. There's also lots of other things we could talk about. Whether it's the way cities are using bond markets, like Houston did after Hurricane Harvey, by rethinking value, by actually, instead of giving the most back to the community, the most expensive things lost, because after all, people with expensive real estate then get the most insurance, right? The bond was actually leveraged towards underserved populations and minority neighborhoods as an effort to try to produce new kind of mechanisms for thinking about ensuring and managing negative futures in beneficial ways. What are the ethics and possibilities of that? That also emerge as part of kind of making Houston resilient, if you will, to ongoing climate crises. So I'm going to end on that. Thank you.
So thank you very much. We're going to introduce now Tomás Bartoletti, who's a senior lecturer and SNF Ambitionen Research Group leader at the chair of the Modern World at ETH Zurich. He earned his Ph.D. from the University of Buenos Aires and studied Latin American literature and linguistics at the same institution, and history of science and technology at the University of Quilmes, also in Argentina. Tomás has led research position as the Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute and a postdoctoral fellow at ETH Zurich. His research interest into the history of science and empire, the history of capitalism, and environmental history. His current research projects focus on the history of pest control and commodity frontiers in the global south and the history of science in Latin America during the 19th century. So thank you very much for being with us today.
Hi everyone. Thanks Orit for this presentation and the important work you are doing. I was really enjoyed Orit this mandate. I think it's I suggest everyone in the room read this book. It's really indeed. I mean, we live in this kind of hegemony of the smartness, and some of us, at least me, we didn't know how it worked and how it was generated. So I think I suggest that you approach this book. Also, Tatiana and Chase for inviting me to this conversation. I have many notes and thoughts, and it's difficult to start with, and the art of commenting is much more difficult than presenting, because you have to speak about something that is not your everyday job. So I will do my best, and indeed I will recall the beginning of the presentation of Orit, which was changing climate anxiety for pessimistic optimism. And I like this move, which is a language move, but it's also an epistemic shift in how we approach this topic of climate, environmental change, and so on. Because, I think at the core of the research on smartness and resilience is changing our binarism. Of course, when I say all binarism is too general, I apologize for this. I think my own, which I tend to believe that are part of the Eurocentric and Western tradition. So when I was reading about the smart, and I was listening now, so the first thing was, okay, interesting. So it's not about to be smart, but to create smartness. And I was considering which is the opposite of smartness, right? And I was going back to my lectures of ancient philosophy, I thought, what will say Socrates and Plato about smartness? Because I remember well, in the categories of ideas and knowledge, there isn't anything similar like smartness. It is intelligence, arguments, opinion, and the worst way of thinking and knowing. But smartness, in which of these categories is there? So then I thought, okay, this is a radical shift in the Western tradition, like to put on the top of knowledge something that is not in the categories that we inherited. So this is okay. It's not an overcoming of these categories, but it's like shifting the center of this discussion. So, and continuing with the binarism, I thought, okay, the opposite of smartness will be stupidity, or then later, of course, more sophisticated is inefficiency. But this move to the millennial tradition of binarism that we inherited, for example, going back to Christianism and paganism, science or reason and superstition, civilization, and wildness, savage, backwardness, and then more in the 20th century, and this is also something that I would like that you say more was about development and underdevelopment. So and certainly smartness, like the regime of smartness. What is the opposite? Like inefficiency, like inefficient societies will be inefficient countries, inefficient economies. So again, I think the difficulty or the challenge of not knowing which is the opposite of that, it's really illuminating. We are changing categories, and of course, it's difficult not to fall in the trap of advocating of the smart mandates. I'm trying to advocate to the ideas of Orit, but not to advocate of the smart mandate. But just when reading it and to now listening, it was okay. Well, it was challenging that for me as a historian to how to frame these dichotomies. That they are always helpful to frame debates and ideas and how they develop. Okay, so this is one of the trips that I have in reading and listening, and then and this connects, and then at some point you reveal in the book, or also which is the opposite. So the opposite of smartness. I mean, sorry, I don't want to recall the argument. I'm just thinking aloud what my impressions, but then the opposite of smartness is rationality. So planning, and then we come to another dimension of this narrative. So we have rationality. Okay, rationality comes together with state planning. So, and then we have adapting as the new paradigm, which is not part of mostly state-led adapting, but mostly business or financial adapting, to creating new cities, new urban spaces, and so on. So, again, I think like working with dichotomies, now I came to the point of, this is the radical shift in paradigm that at least some points the smartness mandate and how it works with resilience is operating. And then so this is one of many of the reflections that I have about this topic. Then it's good planning and adapting. So as you mentioned, time is key for this. And whereas we have planning as learning from the past, we have adapting as potential learnings. And this also changed, and going back to the Socratic conversation, so learning is key for knowledge and wisdom. So learning from the past is one thing, but learning from something that is not already known is quite different strategy. And I think this is also another of the key shifts in your argument. And so probability and all this. So how we prepare to know what we don't know already. And of course, this opens up a new space of speculation, which is the business of business. So speculation, and we know, we know again. So, at least when working in mining in the 19th century was one of my research. So we know that, they suppose that they will find diamonds and gold in some part in the hinterlands of Brazil, Mexico. So, and they invest a lot. So there is this speculative moment. What will be the profit if we find finally the mines that we need? So it's again this expansive frontier of time space through calculating possible futures. And so I think all of this is radically new, at least in my understanding of the Western tradition. So thank you, Orit, for illuminating all of this. It's really we live in such of, I would say, epistemic narrative that I think is coming more and more. And it's important that someone do this work. So so then I shift to other fields regarding the connection of ecology and economics. Certainly your point of departure is the mid-20th century, of course, going back to some Darwinism in the 19th century, but the core of my research is the beginning of 20th century, the connection between insect pests, and you spoke also about DDT, and economics in the emergence of a discipline which was called economic entomology, the science of insect and economic management, and how entomologists, like scientists fighting insects, protect crop and capitalism, and then how through the time was also the point of protecting future pests. So there was already a moment of this. And what I usually tell people about my research is indeed like ecology. It's at the core of capitalism. It's not that we learn, at least I learned against that ecology is like against capitalism. No, ecological science is full into capitalism, and I think this is important also to shed light on this assumption that many of us has about ecology or environmental science, right? They are full in the core of expanding capitalism and extraction. I also, in the book you have a coda which I think, from this pessimistic explanation of the development of the SmartNet mandates, you open up new possibilities and resistance for this smartness mandate. And I think maybe in the presentation there was a bit less about these possibilities, resistances and counter movements, how we can, how if we can at all, at least, to bring new spaces. So you have this wonderful website against catastrophe, where you speak about infrastructure of solidarity, and I think, and again, I think the same about smartness or resilience. I came with this term from more counter-resistant movements and so on, and now I realized indeed resilience was coming from the other point of departure. So I think this is also again illuminating. So then, where is the point of failure? Because this smartness and resilience shows that there is no failure, because failure is part of the process. So, is there any blind spot in this smartness and resilience? Because it seems that everything is part of the system. Failure is already there. So how can we hack? There is a hacking of this mandate. I have many notes more, but I just maybe go back to two last comments or just thoughts. You spoke about the epistemology of ignorance, and I was wondering what is the methodology that the same resilience brings in all of these. And I think you already responded in the book, speaking about how we include other ways of learning that these optimization and adaptive management are excluding, right? And the last, I would like to ask more, but I will just to be brief. So then the other point is about democracy. So at some point, adaptive management, it should be not only the business of business, but also business of democracy, or at least an issue of democracy. And maybe how you relate this smartness mandate and capitalist resilience with the emergence of recent movements of neo-fascism. I think, probably you didn't include it in the book because, it's very recent, so I think you should, I guess you have some thoughts about it. I think I stop here and I give back the word to Orit and open the conversation. Thank you so much again, Orit, for the important work you are doing.
Thank you. Thank you for that really generous reading and a lot of problems. Maybe we could have like a few more seminars and work together. I want to find out from you guys. So there was a lot there. Let me start with, yes, I didn't talk a lot, like movements like Black Lives Matter deploy the term resilience a lot. I work through some critical Black theorists thinking about the question of what it means to, think about, what would it be these are really issues of history and the way we produce narrative and time, what we put these technologies, if you will, into contact or relation with, so that for certain groups, resilience is about recognizing that shock has indeed been, that there's been a huge amount of violence, historically speaking, against them, but that they also seek to survive and even to thrive, even in the face of these negative histories. But I think a critical feature is about the visibility of those conditions that force people, right, to survive the violence. And so these questions of visibility and how we render or temporalize and narrativize the, things like crisis or catastrophe are of course essential. And I think I'm probably saying something you all know. In terms of the very, very elaborate set of questions you're asking me, first I want to say at an overlarging, my current project that I'm working on, which is around the automation of decision making, is really trying to understand actually, what is it? Why is certain types of technological infrastructure so fundamentally seemingly aligned with conservative and alt-right movements? Now there's some obvious things we can, there's been a huge critique in media studies around, just the reduction of language to information, to what it means to be pattern seeking rather than contextualizing, and I think that those things may have been said, but maybe probably still need to be said and said again. And maybe it also comes down to your other question, which is economy. Lately, I don't know if I have any large-scale suggestions on capitalism as a term, but I do find that we can begin thinking about economies and value and how value is produced in maybe more strategic ways, like in ways that you can actually act upon, I don't know, or maybe to help us remember that there isn't such a thing maybe like capitalism just out there. It's actually constructed through assemblages of technologies, people, money, politics, et cetera, so that it actually takes a lot to keep capitalism working the way it does, and that there maybe are ways to be thinking or imagining alternatives, and some of those are definitely around where and what we value. So even in this question of diversity, is it just diversity as a service, or is there some other way that we can, come to value things for being, even if they're of no function to us whatsoever. And So I don't know if that answers anything. It's like a preliminary series of thoughts that we have to get into. To get to smartness, though, in particular, maybe this will come back to the democracy and to the problem of the alt-right and fascism, and just generally the extreme levels of violence that are currently engaging geopolitics. First, when you ask what's the opposite of smartness, our thinking is actually omniscience. It's not dumbness. There is no, this is not a definition. And in many ways, the other inverse of smartness, or some sort of mirror, is reason, not actually rationality. Because historians of science understand rationality to be the computational, calculative modes of reasoning introduced with things like game theory, that in many ways aren't necessarily tied to ideas of consciousness, reason, or liberal subjectivity that originally are the kind of models, at least in Western society, for the Enlightenment and maybe democracy. So it's not school decision making. There's even real questions about where the subject sits in this, right? Like where does this come, like what kind of consciousness do we have of ourselves on TikTok all the time, or what have you? And those are the kind of real questions, but above all, there's a kind of humility to smartness that can be both perhaps the greatest thing and also the key to its incredibly destructive and sort of reactionary political feature, which is, on one hand, it says no one's omniscient, none of us know. So on one hand, it's like, great, it's all DIY, everyone can do everything. But then, of course, you also have these women saying, well, then, why should we believe in government? Why can't why can't everybody just do what they want? If no one, and no one knows better, why not just go ahead and do this? And that this lack of omniscience is also always the insertion of technology. It's precisely because we're not good decision makers. It's precisely because doctors make errors that we need AI, or it's because human beings aren't really good at scale, that machine systems can step in and assist us. So on one hand, we know omniscience is a bad thing, so we're going to have to somehow activate this more humble epistemology. But of course, it can go the other way, which is a kind of embrace of ignorance as a sort of virtue, which seems to be also a feature of the alt-right, since they don't really want anyone to get educated. So those are the questions. So what do we do with that? And then also, of course, there's just this historic, and maybe this is a really boring answer, of this sort of disavowal of not only reason, but there's a real question right now that emerges for us about what stays the same and what changes in history, and sort of what do we want to keep. We want to keep the baby even if we want to throw out the bathwater. So I think the effort to rethink the histories of things like democracy, like David Graeber's trying to do, in relationship to colonial projects and discussions with the Native Americans, for example, in Quebec, or what have you, that recognizes that they were never solely European projects, or never solely anthropocentric in a particular way. Maybe those are necessary for us to rejuvenate, to even try to ask what it means, because it's also not only democracy that's at risk, it's this other term. I mean, after all, fascists get democratically elected, but there's this question of diversity and how, and I hate to be those cliche, how shall we live together? But yeah, actually, with people who are not like us, or we don't affiliate with, or and also with more than human beings. Our question here, and I don't think we answered it very well in the book, I'll be honest. We sort of were kind of well, maybe it's time that we all look at, right now, one of the parts of this other book is I'm really looking at things because maybe it's too American-centric, but I am really looking at the civil rights movement and things like efforts to desegregate the schools, and trying to understand, how can we put those histories into conversation with this learning? and constant adaptation. Like, how do we actually think about learning as a question of diverse institutions and infrastructures, rather than just homogeneous, I don't know, Palantir, Google Data, or TikTok, or whoever? Like, how do we actually have to think about institutional, maybe also spatial diversity? What are the different, like, how can we think about solidarity in terms of the infrastructures we have to build? And how do we actually recognize that learning and adaptation, maybe they're not the same thing? I mean, just adapting to survive, is that the same as having consciousness? Or, you know, and again, sometimes I find I'm like, oh my gosh, I guess I'm a humanist. I'm like back to being like, no, you know, art or literature exceeds, you know, functionality or just adaptability, or maybe, but I still think that maybe it's time to return those debates, actually, to engage with these new technologies. I don't know if that answers anything. So those are my kind of preliminary thoughts, but an overrunning question for me right now is indeed about this kind of seeming, both kind of not being so negative to the, like somehow breaking techno and biological determinism, that like systems have to evolve this way and they demand violence and they'll all end up in these homogeneous reactionary formations, which is sort of a story also media studies tell, like that this is just, that's what computing does. It started with war, it's gonna get, you know, it's just gonna get worse. But at the same time recognizing that that does seem to be the way it goes. So yeah, right now that's a big project for me, is trying to think about how ideas of both biology and economics and psychology were kind of reconfigured in a way that both produced ideas like the neural network and smartness, but also seem to have created a particularly lethal combination of current reactionary, particularly alt-right politics. Which doesn't answer anything. But good question.
So we can open up to the audience for questions now and then circle back for more comments afterwards.
So with some colleagues, including Sid Schindler, Elias, we've been trying to think about sort of like a post-neoliberalization, if there is one. And we've been sort of like thinking through authoritarian urbanism and neoliberalism, but perhaps like not fully satisfied with it, because we always like sort of historical materialist in urban studies and landscape. Always try to look at the long 1980s as the historical moment. You were talking about Bretton Woods and all of that. And I think your talk was quite interesting for me, because you sort of like look at an alternate sort of like starting point, which is, you know, this sort of emergence of cybernetics, and which you sort of like correlate between ecology and like the emergence of, okay, not counting, but like relating. And I'm sort of like putting it together for myself, if I correctly understood it. So you're sort of like proposing a sort of like a parallel starting point for this sort of like resilience paradigm, which is a overarching. Is it a mode of production that is now in full swing? Is that the argument, or is it just a form of just an assemblage which is parallel to this perhaps major neoliberal forms that are concurrently emerging, or is it just like Maria Mies and David Graeber's projects, which was Maria Mies' project was to reread entire capitalist history through feminism, and to perhaps argue that Marx and Engels were wrong, and then, you know, we need to think about women. And Graeber's was like sort of like thinking about anarchy as well, or like self-organization. So is it like a project that you that you sort of achieve through rereading sort of like a kind of history that you're familiar with, of municipalization?
That's a super interesting, both methodological and conceptual. I don't know if I'm nearly as ambitious or competent as many of the people you're listing. So a couple things. Actually, a lot of this came out of, I'm kind of, I guess, a sort of experiment and pretty probably irresponsible actual ethnographer / historian. For good or for bad, we can talk about the method problem. Where I was working on, I was kind of going on these trips looking at Belt Road development and Asia Development Bank projects in Siliguri in kind of West Bengal, and then just kind of got into looking at the links to Kolkata, and then of course I started being really interested in these zones that had first failed to get smartness and then did, and now I have a project there that's looking at smartness and sort of a promise of wealth in like about 5 cities. So it's like a project with a bunch of PIs I collaborate with. So I'm not an expert on Kolkata, but the thing that became interesting to me as I was working there was the way resilience featured in ecological discussions around the East Kolkata waterways, and then the place of these smartness, sometimes typed as green, but usually as innovation centers. How these things were operating in the middle. Of course, they were doing the usual thing that these things do, which is like dispossess lots of people and privatize, develop things for. So a lot of that story is well known, but for me, this term resilience became interesting, and I was like, oh, well, maybe that's something I need to think about. And it kept coming up. Like every city you go to increasingly had resilience planners and always had a climate narrative about how it was going to be resilient. And often that climate narrative sat on top, so this looks like a pretty banal greenfield city, but of course it's right on the border with North Korea. These are geopolitical hotspots too, right? So these complexes are negotiating stuff. In a lot of ways, those things started creating this history. Like I didn't start with a history of capitalism. I started with sort of a series of questions that emerged around these sites I was at. And because I'm historically minded and maybe, unfortunately, I'm mostly a historian of the US, Cold War, that's where you kind of started looking. And also I was working in extraction industries with landscape architects. So a whole series of sites brought me to this question, not perhaps so much histories of capitalism as much as wanting to interfere in histories of technology and how we were narrating the story of computing, but particularly of ubiquitous computing, planetary scale computing, whatever you want to call it, artificial intelligence. So that's just like a method question. And then in terms of this post-neoliberalism and authoritarian urbanism, I'm assuming you mean authoritarian urbanism, you're like China or Singapore, maybe, I don't know if Modi would really count, but is that what you're talking about?
Well, I mean, it's on US campuses right now. It's authoritarian.
I mean, it's on US campuses, like the clearing out of encampments. I mean, maybe that's authoritarian urbanism. I mean, we can debate or discuss. I'm not saying like I like the clearing out of them. I'm just saying institutionally, what are the structures and how are they operating in relationship to these other places? I think those are super interesting questions. I would say that certainly there's been ideas that Trump is a post-neoliberal, or that like, for me, that's an ongoing question. I'm trying to understand the legacies and what that means. Now, most people, a lot of people argue, and in this sense, I would say, I'm not an expert in what authoritarianism constitutes institutionally thinking, but I can say that, a lot of people have asked me about my talks and about AI and have been like, but now we're dealing with places where major actors in geopolitics like China or whatever, are not, still have these highly centralized governments that are making these decisions. And that, what's that doing to your model of neoliberalism? So even if they're steadfastly neoliberal in terms of allowing people to compete and there's like vicious competition in the AI or EV market within, still there's this hyper managed. And I think that's a question for us right now to ask. That's a lot of people would say, well, it's not the encampments that are, the police have been authoritarian forever in the United States. So like, is this actually, and what have they not been under neoliberalism? I mean, that would be, an interesting question. But, what we can say is they may be increasingly privatized. And we may actually talk about the fact that so few of those campuses are public spaces to start with. There's no public infrastructure for education in the United States, or increasingly less. So I don't know. That doesn't answer any like a specific set, except that smartness is prevalent in multiple types of systems, both from a neoliberal kind of imaginary of self-organization and obviously states that view themselves as authoritarian. And we can ask how that changes our definitions of any of these things. Did that answer? I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I think there's I think I really need to read your book actually to understand it, but I mean, maybe it's my projection, but I think this sort of like proposition of understanding resilience almost as a mode of production these days. Like it's I mean, because under neoliberalization we've understood speculative urbanism or speculation as a mode of production, where resilience is going even further, right? Like it's a new mode of production.
I mean, that's a really nice formulation for me to go, thanks. You put that better than me. I mean, I think that's something to think about. So like Louisa Moore, another person who works on like generative AI and power and politics and stuff, has been thinking with me on resilience as kind of the logic of power in generative AI. I think that it hints at also the place that things like survivalism, like coming back to the alt-right, like there's such a biological discourse around survivalism that legitimates, right, authoritarian behavior, right? So there is something happening here about the collapse of the biological and the technical, and also the way determinism is being dealt with in terms of what has to happen in order that and the return of survivalism. This isn't just about Keynesian nice prosperity. Like it's taken a very bleak and very violent, literally, take. So I think that's a really interesting and compelling formulation that I actually have to say, because I don't come from, I wasn't really thinking about it as a mode of production, but it certainly is, I think, in terms of generating a lot of economy.
I was wondering if throughout your research, you've come across spaces where dominant models of resilience, like for corporations, institutions, governments, interact in unexpected ways with more minority models or ideas of resilience, like social movements, subaltern groups, things like that?
Obviously, yes. I mean, like coming back, Black Lives Matter and like whatever the security private securities area think, they're going to have different understandings of what resilience means as a category. Where the discussion actually kind of breaks down is the wars that are happening over infrastructure all the time. So, and I guess this comes back to this mode of production idea, which I quite like now. Well, no, because survivalism really, when things get recouched as survival, anything is allowed. Like now you can kill anyone, you can do anything because this is survival. And that's a discourse that's been coming up, and I think it penetrates even not necessarily as extreme as, you know, current Israel-Gaza discourses or not discourses, actual wars, but like even a lot of discussions around environmental management, like whether we're gonna build a seawall or whether we're gonna build a wetland or whether we're gonna do this, like a lot of these debates over the right direction for planning and these battles, you know, come formulated in particular ways. Now, sometimes, of course, like in the case of Japan, where they're building these insane seawalls, and it's just about developers, really, it's not really a great I mean, there's a lot of scientific evidence that's not wonderful, but these things are now being framed in ways that make it extremely uncontestable. And this, and you're seeing also vast clashes across the board. You know, I mean, because alt-right discourses do frame themselves consistently as needing to keep themselves alive, that we're under a kind of existential threat from, you know, women, people of color, any number of groups. You're seeing this kind of emerging concept emerge a lot. You're also seeing it emerge, like there's also different debates about the scale of resilience. I think that's one of the big political fights is actually which scale. So we open this, Chase was saying, you know, it's about individualizing response. Well, the psychologization of resilience, like now, I don't know, I have a lot of friends that have kids that are age 5 or whatever, like they're starting to make everyone resilient in school. Like prepared for adversity, like learn how to lose your job. You see this in the New York Times all the time. They're like, you know, how to cope with the fact that, you know, you're not being treated too well by capitalism. You know, like, but you should learn how to cope on your level. Like, do we make, like, at which level also things are resilient and foster diversity or, you know, manage shock is also a political question. So making all of us ready to lose our jobs 50 times and accept precarity, that's very different than saying, oh, okay, I want to build a resilient, I don't know, education system or healthcare system that could be as, you know, infrastructure for care. So does that help? I don't know if I have an answer.
I have 2 questions. One is about the methodology you were talking about, and it's something that struggles very much when you re-enter to your website for the first time, to this Against Catastrophe website. And we saw that actually the people working on the project, they come from very different backgrounds. And we were very much interested in why and how and what are these different backgrounds and how is the field that it's like being like worked there in a sense. That's a question that if you want to refer to that. And the other one, it's coming back to Tomás' comments about the idea of the failure. That it's something that you didn't refer that much, and it's this question of how where is the failure if the failure is included in the system, right? And we're referring to this idea before of the equilibrium, and now we're thinking actually as resilience as this like narrative that doesn't seems to have a failure because it's like kind of absorbing everything. And I wonder also what is the role of models there. I mean, we have been speaking about models non-stop, but not referring directly to it, and how much the title of the session today has to do with future, right? And how much we are thinking about future through models, and what is the big difference that it has to do with 19th century vision of the future, that it has to do with much more like photography of the future. I don't know. So yeah, it's not a very formulated question, but I'm curious about these topics.
No, those are excellent, really big questions. First you were asking me, okay, so you were asking about the question of the model you were also asking about method and the people who work on these projects. I would say, I guess, I'm sort of patchwork in terms of both ethnography and history. I mean, I definitely have a historian sensibility. I want to situate things, but I also think it's pretty important today. If you're trying to work across aesthetic, political, economic, and even be diverse in kind of engaging geographies and locations, you kind of can't do it all yourself, right? So you need people who come from different places and do different things and have radically different perspectives. I mean, I think that's kind of part of the commitment, is trying to, as also someone who takes very seriously, like my main political and ethical engagement is actually with pedagogy and, you know, the university, which itself is I think an important institution. I mean, we're too quick to say that also education doesn't matter. It does, which is why the right always goes straight for it first. So I think that there's a lot to be done there, and so you, in some sense, you want to try to use your resources or develop, you know, networks and groups of research and infrastructures that reflect and advance your own obligation to diversity and to different forms of thinking. So a lot of my postdocs, you know, not mine, they're not mine, they work with me, they're collaborative. This is spending too much time in Germany. I mean, whatever, I'm not even gonna go into the fact that they still use the word secretary, but it's okay. But, people, you know, that they should reflect and advance your own kind of objectives. So they do come from a lot of different geographies, from a lot of different places, and a lot of different fields. Then in terms of, also I think we have to take seriously what it means to experiment, and what that induces, and what we take from histories of scientific experimentation, where we want to break away from them, of course, in terms of, you know, producing new forms of thinking, and also not necessarily always, you know, being authoritative, or so those are issues that kind of shape the method feature, I guess. And also I think that we have to be, or I don't know if we have to, but I think there's something important about learning from what you study and trying to think about empiricism, the types of data, and how we make data, and thinking reflexively about that. So I don't know if that's like a set thing, but it's something I'm constantly thinking about, like what constitutes empiricism and evidence, and also how we craft it. Because at the end of the day, coming back to your other issues around failure, you know, a lot of things about what comes to matter is actually coming back to kind of, maybe these are old school answers, they're like, it is about narrative and meaning making around data sets, and what it means to failure comes back to your model and to your metrics, right? Like, what's your model of the world? If the model is that, you know, if you think like human beings are just violent and kill each other and that's what they do, then I guess like the world is fine. Or if you think hierarchy is a norm, right? So our models obviously impact the expectations, but that comes back to a different issue, which I fundamentally think smartness doesn't engage, and I'm not even sure the term learning does, which is terms like, as overused as they are, imagination or desire, these other features that exceed perhaps simply the fully legible and articulatable and even kind of quantifiable or calculatable in the moment. And those are kind of, I guess that's where a lot of us work in terms of thinking about how we both address the present but produce the future. So I don't know if that, but within the system, the issue of failure is, of course, an endemic problem, because in some sense, it's sort of like, what's your perspective? Because from the perspective of a derivative pricing equation, every single market crash wasn't a failure. You were supposed to create volatility and it happened. That wasn't a failure. That was just like the technology doing what it's supposed to do, or kind of acting in a particular way. It was a failure when you lost your home for you, if you're a homeowner or what have you, right? So again, these are perspective questions, and they're questions about how we make different perspectives visible and legible, and so on and so forth.
When we're discussing about volatility and risk management, it's kind of like reciprocal from one to another. And when we put resilience in between, so it becomes, it's kind of a result out of that. It neutralizes itself. But if we take that out of context, what does that mean? That the resilience, does that exist in the first place without having that bouncing back and forth?
I mean, I think it's a perspective question, and I think you're asking a really interesting question that's also important, maybe politically and ethically, to also sometimes separate that not all things are commensurate. That in their action in the realm of economics and human management, that indeed, these are iterative things that come back and forth and get negotiated through a language of something like resilience or adaptive management, or what have you. But of course, for certain ecologists or whatever, resilience is like a property of an environmental system or an ecological system. I mean, it's also could be something beyond or outside our risk management properties, which is where these debates about the Anthropocene and Earth systems and biodiversity happen. That they're obviously impacted, but they're not entirely manageable by us. And maybe that's this other question that looms here, which is around the idea of the question of the planetary and the interface between human, biological Earth systems. So there's different kind of perspectives and different scales you could take this language of resilience, and it does really different work in those different perspectives. So when you talk to biodiversity people, it's not something even like we can always manage. Even if we're an actor in the system, and in certain responsibilities, but it's not necessarily like people are like, have we gone beyond? It's like these like tipping points and black swan events, and have we gone? Can we even manage the spiral?
Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Orit, for this fantastic lecture and for addressing all of our questions as well. See you next week. Thank you, Tomás, as well.